The influence of organized crime extends everywhere. Drugs, loan sharking, protection rackets, shakedowns, gambling, prostitution, money laundering, waste disposal, and the music industry. It's not something we hear about so much anymore, but in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was very much a thing. And if you were operating in the music business during those decades, you would have come across Morris Levy. Morris liked to project the image of the savvy businessman, an entrepreneur running a successful record label called Roulette, who was also a philanthropist, raising money for charities like opera companies and children's hospitals. But sitting atop his vast pyramid of companies, Levy stole money from artists, shook down record retailers, laundered money, cheated record pressing plants, and threatened people who got in his way. His influence was far, far greater than the size of Roulette Records would indicate. If you wanted to stand up to Morris, you had to be careful. There was a .38 in his desk drawer, and he had several associates on the payroll. They carried baseball bats in case a meeting turned difficult. And if that didn't scare you, there were his silent backers in the mob. With this backroom help, Morris was able to get his way with everyone from young emerging singers to, believe it or not, John Lennon. Levy ran his corner of the music business his way for decades, until he couldn't. I'm Alan Cross, and this is Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And this is part 2 of Morris Levy, music's most mobbed up man. The Sopranos has gone down in television history as one of the best depictions of the mob in America. If you know the show, you'll remember a character named Hesh Rabkin. He was the founder of F-Note Records, sometime back in the 1950s. He got rich by exploiting the dreams of young musicians by adding his name to co-writing credits on songs and then cheating the artists out of their rightful royalties. Sopranos creator David Chase didn't create Hesh out of nothing. His real-life inspiration was Morris Levy, the head of Roulette Records and a close friend of the Genovese crime family. On part 1 of this 2-part series, we looked at Levy's rise from a coat check boy to a nightclub owner to the head of Roulette Records, one of the most notorious labels in the history of the music industry. We explored his mob associations, his methods of doing business, his radio payola methods, and the artists who suffered because of it. Now we'll continue with Morris's story starting in the early 1970s, when he returned from a 6-month hideout in Spain during New York's mob wars, when Morris was definitely on the wrong side. It's impossible to tell his story in an orderly chronological way, so bear with me as we jump back and forward a bit as we go through his various schemes, ranging from bootlegging records to more radio payola to strong-arming John Lennon into doing something against Lennon's will. We'll start with Promo Records, one of Morris's many companies. It was founded in 1969 as a way to capitalize on records that wouldn't sell. Levy's partner in the operation was Tommy Eboldi, a former boss in the Genovese crime family. They dealt in extra stock, burdening major record labels that was just taking up space in warehouses. These records were known as remainders or cutouts. Depending on the year, there could be up to 100 million of these unwanted records. Promo Records bought up this vinyl in bulk at a huge discount and then sold them to retailers with whatever markup they could get, which sounds fine, right? But actually, this remainder business was open to all kinds of fraud. For example, you could buy a couple of hundred remainder records and then press up thousands of bootlegs based on those records. Did artists get royalties on any of this? No. Some labels even deliberately pressed up too many records so they would immediately become remainders, which could be sold on to companies like Promo Records. They made a profit on the sale and didn't have to pay royalties. There were other loopholes too. When the Electric Light Orchestra changed distributors from United Artists to Columbia, there were over 1 million copies of their Out of the Blue album still in United Artists warehouses. Promo Records picked up 1.2 million of them of a still well-selling album for peanuts, and then sold them on for a profit with no money going to ELO. This gray area of the music business helped Morris Levy make up to $15 million a year, and eventually The FBI took notice. In 1978, Promo Records was investigated after a sting was set up with agents posing as record counterfeiters. While more than a dozen people and companies were convicted, Levy and Promo Records escaped prosecution. How? Well, perhaps by being a silent broker between the major labels and small, low-budget record distributors, a position that gave them deniability. Promo Records went out of business in 1983, but Levy kept his fingers in the cutout game, resulting in 3 grand jury investigations on how organized crime made money from this corner of the music industry. One guy, a Levy customer named John Lamont, took delivery of 5 million cutouts from MCA Records in April 1984. His partner was Palmer Bracco, a cousin of someone high up in the DeCalvanti family in New Jersey. The deal was arranged by Salvatore Pisello, a soldier in the Gambino family. The allegation was that Levy and Roulette Records guaranteed MCA $1.4 million for the cutouts. This was 60 truckloads of records. Money was funneled through a company called Consultants for World Records. It was controlled by Pisello and 2 other members of the Genovese family. Long story short, Lamont found that he'd been ripped off. All the good titles by big artists, Elton John, Neil Diamond, Olivia Newton-John, had been skimmed off by Levy and Pisello. Word eventually got to the FBI after Pisello threatened Lamont. And then Corky Vastola, Palmer Bracco's cousin, broke Lamont's face so badly that he required hospitalization. This allegedly was with a single punch. The investigation saw Lamont go into the witness protection plan, and Pisello was eventually convicted of tax evasion. Fritz Giovanello, one of the Genovese wise guys, was eventually arrested for killing a New York police detective. Morris Levy, unscathed. Let's go even deeper into Roulette's mob connections. Joseph Pagano was a mobster who knew all about loan sharking, extortion, and fraud. He partnered with Levy in 1969, probably on the say-so of Tommy Eboli, the former Genovese boss. Pagano had a couple of girlfriends who thought they had what it took to be stars. As a favor, about $250,000 was spent on a record that went absolutely nowhere. Pagano and Eboli had a nightclub that was supposedly designed to help emerging artists. In a convoluted arrangement, it appears that Eboli received some kind of compensation in the form of free and royalty-free records for his network of jukeboxes. This helped inflate Roulette's sales numbers, pushing these records up the charts. Tracing any financial transactions were very difficult. Authorities investigating Levy could do nothing. But if you remember from Part 1, Tommy Eboli was assassinated by persons unknown in a very gangland-style shooting on July 16, 1972. His role in the mob was filled by Vincent the Chin Gigante, boss of the Genovese family. FBI informants would later say that whatever the Chin wanted, Levy delivered. By the early 1980s, mobsters were involved in roulette operations more than ever. We need to back up again. Levy was always looking for ways to make big money selling cheap records. Inspired by Canada's K-Tel records and their inexpensive and profitable way of recycling records that were no longer on the charts, Levy created a couple of labels that sold records via late-night TV ads that ran in over 300 cities. Were sales figures accurate? No. Were all the royalties paid? Probably not. Check this out. Levy was often the publisher and the person licensing these songs. Therefore, he could make a deal with himself to pay nothing in royalties. He could sell these albums at $6.98 for almost pure profit, since the artists got nothing. This turned out to be a very profitable venture, with Levy shipping sometimes nearly 15,000 records a day. It gets even better. In 1976, Levy bought his own chain of record stores. Strawberry Records, a group of stores in New England, went bankrupt, and Levy snapped them up. His partners in the purchase were, you guessed it, from the mob, specifically the Genovese family. This was how the family infiltrated yet another legitimate business. Strawberry's plan was to sell records at a steep discount. While other stores had records for $6.98, the Strawberry's retail price was $2.99. How they managed to do that is suspicious, because $2.99 is way below even the wholesale price. This worked well, squeezing out the competition and allowing Strawberry's to expand to 40 locations. Who helped renovate these new stores? Yes, mob-controlled businesses, especially those supplying concrete, a mafia specialty. Vincent the Chin Gigante approved everything. Here's another scheme. Levy created a label called Tiger Lily Records. The concept was ingenious. Sign up a whole bunch of acts with no prospects of success. Press up a minimum number of records, maybe 1,000, and then just let them sit there in a warehouse. On the books, though, the number of records reportedly pressed went from 1,000 to 25,000, most of which didn't even exist. When they didn't sell, they were destroyed. And that generated a tax write-off, not for 1,000 copies that did not sell, but this fictitious 25,000. Levy continued to leverage his music publishing empire in, shall we say, interesting ways. And in the mid-1970s, he turned to a new target, John Lennon. And what happened in this case is wild. If there's one thing Morris Levy had plenty of, it was chutzpah. And one of the greatest examples of this was his strong-arming of John Lennon in the mid-1970s. The roots of all this began in 1969 when the Beatles released Come Together as part of the Abbey Road album. The first line of the song, sung by Lennon, goes, "Here come old flat top. He come grooving up slowly." Now, technically, this song is a Lennon-McCartney composition, but in actual fact, it was a Lennon creation. Morris Levy heard that and thought, hey, that's close enough to a line in Chuck Berry's 1958 song Can't Catch Me. This was a song written about a Cadillac, which had what was colloquially known as a flathead engine. In Can't Catch Me, Berry refers to the engine as a flat top. The line in the song is, "Here comes a flat top." Therefore, in Levy's reasoning, John Lennon had plagiarized Chuck Berry, and Levy just happened to own the publishing to this Chuck Berry song, and he wanted justice. In 1971, Levy filed a lawsuit against Lennon, demanding that he be compensated. It was a case that took years to play out. But before the case could go to court in December 1973, Lennon and Levy came to an agreement that they hoped would avoid a lengthy trial. Also, potentially millions in payouts by Lennon and a loss of control of Come Together by the Beatles. But instead of seeking money, Levy came up with a plan. Lennon, he said, would record 3 songs on his next album, all of which had copyrights owned by Levy. As a major artist and an ex-Beatle, any Lennon album would sell extremely well. So that meant Lennon's covers of Levy's songs would generate a lot of revenue for Levy, more money than he could ever expect in a plagiarism settlement. Most musicians, knowing Levy's reputation and his mob connections, would not have put up a fight. But Lennon did not want to settle. He was fed up with being ripped off by managers himself and watching other artists shortchanged by labels and publishers. He was especially angry at those who took advantage of black artists, people such as, Morris Levy. Lennon told his lawyer, Jay Bergen, "I want to be rid of him. I'm tired of these phony legal cases. I want to put a stop to them. I don't want to do any deals with Morris. He wants to cheat me like he's cheated other singers and songwriters." So the easiest way out of this was for Lennon to agree to Levy's plan. He liked oldies, and he'd already been talking about releasing an album of covers. After all, 50s music was experiencing a comeback in the early 70s, thanks to movies like American Graffiti and greaser bands like Sha Na Na. So in the fall of 1973, he and producer Phil Spector started work on a record that would be known as Rock and Roll. These sessions did not work out well. Lennon was in his Lost Weekend era, separated from Yoko and doing a lot of drugs and drinking very heavily. Spector was a weird dude too. One night, Spector showed up dressed like a surgeon and fired a shotgun into the studio ceiling. Spector then stole the master tapes and kept them away from Lennon. On March 31st, Spector was involved in a car crash that left him in a coma. This put the entire project on hold, so Lennon embarked on a new project, which resulted in more things being put on hold. But even as he lay in a hospital bed, Spector held the tapes hostage at his home. Lennon could not get at them. Now, Lennon, who was coming out of this dark period, felt that he was on a creative roll. Rather than wait for Spector to recover, he started on a new album, one that would become the Walls and Bridges release of late 1974. Eventually, the rock and roll tapes were acquired from Spector for $90,000 in ransom, and Lennon put them on the shelf. He was more concerned about finishing walls and bridges. When Levy got wind of this, he was furious, claiming that Lennon had welched on their deal. After threatening to refile the lawsuit, Lennon explained the situation. Levy wanted results, so he offered Lennon the use of a studio on his farm in upstate New York so he could complete this obligatory album. By late 1974, things had progressed to the point where Lennon was able to send some rough mixes to Levy, just to get him to stop pestering him. "This isn't the final version of my album," he said. I might have to delete some of the crummy tracks, the ones that I don't like." This included a song called Ya Ya, a song released by Lee Dorsey in 1961. The copyright was owned by, yes, Morris Levy. The original recording from these upstate New York sessions features an 11-year-old Julian Lennon on drums. The performance was definitely not up to snuff for Lennon, and we would later learn that this was by design. He wanted to annoy Levy. Levy couldn't help but notice that Lennon introduces the song by saying, "Okay, we'll do this sitting in the la-la. We'll get rid of that," which was a bit of a shot at Levy.
Okay, we'll do sitting in the la-la. I'll get rid of that. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Instead of offering notes and feedback, which was what Lennon expected, Levy just went ahead and released those tapes. He released an album called Roots, John Lennon Sings the Greatest Rock and Roll Hits, which he marketed through his late-night TV ads. That campaign lasted 3 days before Apple Records and EMI demanded that it be pulled off the market. Weirdly, though, Lennon appeared in those TV ads on his own volition. He knew that by cutting out Apple and EMI, he would, in fact, make more money. Levy, for his part, thought he'd found a loophole in Lennon's contract. Did it include any stipulation or carve-out for mail-order sales? It did not. He got that advice from Alan Klein, the last-ever Beatles manager. About 1,270 copies were sold during those 3 days. The record itself did, in fact, sound awful due to the unfinished mixes. Some songs were sped up, so more tracks could be fit on each side of the album. The artwork was terrible, dingy, and poorly executed. In the end, Lennon did deliver a finished and polished version of the album, which ended up being released on February 17, 1975. So much time and money had been spent that no one wanted to see it all flushed away, and that included the $90,000 in ransom money that had been paid to Phil Spector. But then Levy sued Lennon and EMI anyway for $42 million for breach of contract. Lennon and EMI countersued. The case went to court in February 1976, and surprisingly, given the personalities involved, it attracted very little press attention at the time. On the first day of the trial, there were only 2 spectators in the courtroom, the lawyer's mother and his aunt. Lennon testified that the unauthorized album was shoddy, and that the Beatles would not let something that looked or smelled like this be anywhere near the public. On August 10, 1976, it was over. Lennon and EMI were the winners. Levy won a small sum of money for the perceived infringement on the Chuck Berry song, but he had to pay about $400,000, including $110,000 to EMI for lost revenues and another $42,000 to Lennon for reputational damage relating to the shoddy and cheap Levy version of the record. Now, the judgment was appealed and the amounts were reduced, but the fact remained. John Lennon had defeated the powerful and fearsome and mob-connected Morris Levy. Now, if you can find a copy of Roots, John Lennon Sings the Greatest Rock and Roll Hits in mint condition, you actually have a real collector's item. Copies have been known to change hands for $2,000 or more. It's also been bootlegged countless times, which is rather ironic. Meanwhile, the official version of rock and roll did, okay, going gold in several countries. But Morris Levy would not be deterred. He would continue his way of doing business. But the end was in sight. The story of his fall is coming up next. Morris Levy thought he could bully John Lennon into submission. When it became apparent that he couldn't, others realized that Levy could be defeated. He was not invulnerable. And for the next 10 years, from the end of the Lennon trial to 1986, Levy was involved in a lot of litigation. Part of the issue is that managers and artists had gotten wise to the way of the record business. They knew enough not to be taken advantage of by the old ways, Morris's ways. The record business was also consolidating from many small labels into fewer big ones. corporations that were run like corporations. Levy also got into a fight with an off-duty cop outside a New York nightclub. The beating administered by Levy cost the cop an eye. Weirdly, the case was dropped before it went to trial, and any record of the arrest and charges disappeared. A civil case was settled out of court. As for his record business, Levy kept doing what he'd always done, messing with artists and their royalties. There were bootlegs, questionable assigning of copyright, and unauthorized reissues on fly-by-night labels owned by Levy. Another artist who fought back was country singer Emmylou Harris. She successfully sued Levy for royalties after he re-released an old album of hers without permission. That cost him about $100,000 in 1979. There was a record of early Bob Marley recordings that involved shady deals and bounced checks. Levy staged a July 4th concert in 1977 that was allegedly financed by the Genovese family. It did not go well. It said about 200,000 people attended, but only 10,000 legitimate tickets were sold. The Genovese wise guys were not happy. The bodies of the alleged counterfeiters, the people who sold 190,000 fake tickets, were found 2 days after the concert. Bob Nighthawk Terry, the radio DJ who emceed and co-produced the event, disappeared. His body was never found. And remember Nate McCalla from the first episode? He was Levy's longtime associate and bodyguard who went on the lam with Levy during the mob wars of the early 1970s. Well, he was found dead in his Fort Lauderdale home. He'd been shot in the back of the head. The TV was left on, the windows were sealed, and the heat was turned on full. So you can imagine what it was like when his body was found a week later. His killer was never found. There were more crappy rip-off fad records using studio musicians. There was a record called Benihana, which also happened to be the name of a chain of Japanese steakhouses. The owner of those steakhouses, a millionaire named Hiroki Aoki, was asked to underwrite the recording. He agreed, but only on the condition that he could dictate the woman who would sing the song. Aoki owned the old Wii magazine, the softcore porno mag. He wanted porn star Marilyn Chambers to be the singer, and he got his way. And Benihana was released on Roulette Records.
When you call my name, we make love in the darkness every night.
Neither Levy or Aoki had any issue with Chambers promoting the record at radio conventions wearing just a body stocking or completely topless. Another porn mag, Screw, named it Record of the Year. Roulette made a good buck on the record. Chambers and the songwriters did not. When the record industry had its post-disco crash, it experienced negative growth for the first time since the Depression. Roulette's fortunes suffered. Levy's record chain, Strawberries, was in trouble and behind on payments for inventory. Levy and the chain were sued for unpaid bills. Artists began to hire lawyers and advocates to go after Levy for unpaid royalties. One such person was Chuck Rubin, who began acting on behalf of artists from the 50s and 60s, many of them black, to get back royalties from Levy. This was aided by a change in U.S. copyright laws that allowed artists to reacquire copyrights that had been signed away. Among Rubin's clients was the estate of Frankie Lyman, who wanted to know where all the money was going from that 1950s hit, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Diana Ross covered it in 1981, and it was making a lot of cash for Levy and no one else. And in 1984, Rubin was successful. The money started going to Lyman's estate. Roulette was in trouble throughout the early 1980s. The offices on the 18th floor of 1760 Broadway looked old and worn. There was Levy and a few staff. The output had dwindled to reissue albums that were sold in the discount bins or through late-night TV ads. With money tight, Levy had to rely on the good graces of the mob. There was always the presence of Vincent the Chin Gigante, a 6-foot, 300-pound monster who had been the underboss to Genovese leader Fat Tony Salerno. When Fat Tony got busted and jailed, the Chin assumed control of the entire family. He was always in the office representing the Genovese family. They acquired more and more of Roulette and the Strawberries record chain. Levy was told to hire the Chin's mistress to work in the office, probably so part of her salary, bonuses, and loans could be passed on to the Genovese people. Strange how she never actually showed up in the office, too. The FBI, still very interested in the payola game, wanted to know how deep the mob's tentacles penetrated into the record industry. So in 1984, they launched a 3.5-year investigation into how organized crime and the record business were intertwined. One of the things they did was tap Levy's phones, as well as those of the Chin's mistress, a woman named Olympia Esposito. In the middle of the night, a bug was planted in a sign behind Levy's desk that proclaimed, "Oh Lord, give me a bastard with talent." A microphone was hidden in the O of Lord. There were also 2 holes in the ceiling that allowed cameras to peer in. And that's how the FBI learned how money was passing from Levy and Roulette to the mob. They also learned that Levy was behind a real estate company that financed a $500,000 brownstone love nest for the Chin and his mistress. And it, too, was bugged by the FBI. Gigante was so involved in Levy's business that by the mid-'80s, Levy couldn't do anything, and I mean anything, without the Chin's approval. This included doing deals with the Chin's friends who wanted to distribute records. And one deal involved selling records through local unions controlled by the mob. Further investigations brought up John Lamont. Remember him from the cutout record scheme? The guy who was beaten up and extorted by people connected to Levy when he had the gall to complain about being ripped off in a $1 million-plus distribution deal involving 60 truckloads or 4.7 million copies of albums from MCA Records? Remember the guy who did the beating? Tommy Vistola, the mob-connected guy who was once DJ Alan Freed's manager and who lended Lamont $50,000 with a VIG of 2% a week or 104% per year? He thought he'd made his point after he put Lamont in the hospital with a caved-in face. But Lamont still wouldn't pay up, perhaps because he had a side deal going with Vistola's cousin and maybe a few other people offshore. Whatever the case, conversations about what to do about Lamont in this deal were captured by FBI bugs. The feds were worried that Lamont was about to be whacked for not paying his debt, which by now amounted to over $600,000. After his beating, Lamont went to the FBI and began wearing a wire to all meetings with Vistola, who was still working in cahoots with Morris Levy. Lamont also started feeding information to an investigative reporter at the LA Times about MCA Records, Roulette Records, and all his mob connections. In June 1986, Howard Fisher, a longtime Levy associate, was pressured by the FBI to enter the Witness Protection Program in exchange for testifying against Levy and Vistola. He gave the feds enough information for them to serve subpoenas to Levy at Roulette's offices on July 21, 1986, saying also that they believed that Levy was in danger of being whacked on the orders of the Chin. They hoped this would be enough for Levy to turn evidence on his mob friends, but he refused. On September 24, 1986, 17 people associated with Tommy Vistola were arrested. They were charged with 117 criminal counts. Levy was listed as being part of 3 of those charges. If convicted, he faced up to 60 years in prison. Levy was arrested at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston. Released on bail, he was asked by NBC News about his mob relationships, and he stated, and I quote, "There is no connection between the mob and the music business." When asked if the FBI offered him a chance to join the Witness Protection Program and turn state's evidence, Levy said, "Yeah, but I turned them down." This may have been Levy sending a message to his mob buddies, assuring them that he wasn't going to be a rat. He never did talk. The case was very complicated and took a long time to organize. In the end, it was decided that the trial would be divided into 7 different parts. In the first proceeding, the court learned that Gambino crime boss Joseph Bonanno knew all about Levy's connections with Vincent the Chin Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family. There was talk of having Levy whacked over a deal gone wrong, but after a sit-down, Levy agreed to pay $100,000 to the offended mobster. There were more claims that Levy wanted to have Bonanno's brother put down. The commission, the organization comprising of all 5 families, voted that one down. Finally, Levy went to trial, and he was found guilty on counts of conspiracy to extort. This was June 1st, 1988. Another story emerged. Levy allegedly set up purchases of heroin for a Philadelphia drug kingpin named Roland Bartlett. That affected Levy's sentencing. An appeal was denied on October the 28th of 1988. Levy was sentenced to 10 years in prison and given a fine of $200,000. Bail was set at $3 million. The court accepted his rural New York State farm as collateral for that. Meanwhile, the Strawberries record chain was sold to a former RCA executive named Jose Menendez. Now, this is the same Jose Menendez that was murdered, along with his wife Kitty, by their sons Eric and Lyle. Before the sons were arrested, there were rumors that Jose and Kitty's killing was a message from the mob. 10 days after the murders, a rumor spread that Morris Levy had been whacked while sitting in his car in New Jersey. That didn't happen, of course, but it gives you an idea of how skittish people were about Levy and his mob connections. Strawberries would eventually find a buyer, with Levy netting about $40 million from the sale of 81 stores. All of his music publishing assets were sold for $10 million. It should have gone for much, much more, but because of the dubious nature of so many of the publishing deals and all the lawsuits connected with them, and because Levy spent decades draining those companies dry, 10 mil was all he could get. And Roulette Records went for about 5 mil. Morris Levy would not serve a day in jail. He was diagnosed with colon cancer in late 1988. Surgery didn't help. In fact, a 1989 colonoscopy resulted in a perforated small intestine. He was in and out of hospital, with his health complicated by pre-existing cardiac conditions brought upon by a heart attack in 1979. There was an aneurysm in his heart. By November 1989, the cancer had spread to his liver. He appealed to have his jail sentence dropped because of his poor health, but was denied. Instead, he was granted a 90-day stay so he could perhaps recover enough to report to prison. But the cancer continued to metastasize until he died at his rural farm on May 21, 1989. That was about 2 months before he was supposed to be jailed. Lawsuits over Levy's malfeasance continued for years after his death. There have been several books about his career. He's been portrayed in movies, and like I said at the beginning, he was the inspiration for Hesh Rabkin, the crooked label owner on The Sopranos. Some artists managed to recover some of their lost royalties, although many did not. Roulette Records still exists. It's run by Warner Music, but it handles mostly the label's old jazz recordings. The record industry is a very, very different place than it was when Morris Levy got involved in the mid-1950s. Oh, there's still plenty of weirdness and illegalities if you know where to look, but mobbed up like the old days? No, probably not. Morris Levy seems to have been among the last of his kind. Although he's also remembered for great acts of philanthropy, he has gone down in history as the most mobbed-up music man of all time. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. They are free for the taking. If the Morris Levy story has you hooked, I recommend that you check out episodes 20 and 21 of Uncharted, which explore the great American payola scandals of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on most of the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com, which is updated with music news and recommendations every single day. It also comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music through the decades. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy, all for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.